So when Paul asked me to do the presentation for this colloquium on the theme of inclusion, I must admit I wasn't quite sure exactly what to do. Not so much in the bigger picture of recent political events and global upheavals, and my own anxieties of inclusion seem to be more personal and with little connection to the bigger sweep of things. However, I'd recently been reading an article on philosophy in prison and had attended a seminar earlier in the year in which an academic had described their philosophical work with prisoners, in this case using film to engage prisoners in philosophical discussion. And I became interested in the contrast between the treatment of those philosophers in the history of philosophy, like Socrates and Bertius, who had been imprisoned and executed for their thought, and the idea that philosophy is of value in rehabilitating prisoners. And it hinted at an ambivalence towards philosophical thinking that on the one hand might lead to demands that the philosopher is excluded, marginalized, cast out, and on the other that through philosophy the prisoner might be brought back into the human community, not necessarily sort of released, but in some sense that their humanity is acknowledged. So I wanted to begin with the idea, and certain ideas about the philosopher are quite sort of powerful. And I wanted to begin with the idea of the philosopher as an outsider, by reading the account of the death of Socrates and then looking at this painting by David. And this is the moment, and it's the same moment that is sort of described in both. So Socrates drinks the poison. He handed the cup to Socrates, who received it quite cheerfully without a tremor, without any change of colour or expression, and said, looking up under his brows with his usual steady gaze, "What do you say about pouring a libation from this drink? Is it permitted or not?" "We only prepare what we regard as the normal dose, Socrates," he replied. "I see," said Socrates, "but I suppose I am allowed, or rather bound, to pray the gods that my removal from this world to the other may be prosperous. This is my prayer then, and I hope it may be granted." With these words, quite calmly and with no sign of distaste, he drained the cup in one breath. Up till this time, most of us had been fairly successful in keeping back our tears. But when we saw that he was drinking, that he had actually drunk it, we could do so no longer. In spite of myself, the tears came pouring out, so that I covered my face and wept broken-heartedly, not for him, but for my own calamity in losing such a friend. Crito had given up even before me, and had gone out when he could not restrain his tears. But Apollodorus, who had never stopped crying even before, now broke out into such a storm of passionate weeping that he made everyone in the room break down, except Socrates himself, who said, "Really, my friends, what a way to behave. Why, that was my main reason for sending away the women, to prevent this sort of disturbance, because I am told that one should make one's end in a tranquil frame of mind. Calm yourselves and try to be brave." And this is the same moment that is captured by the painter David in his painting The Death of Socrates, or Socrates at the moment of grasping the hemlock. And for David, Socrates is an heroic figure who is unjustly condemned, but who sacrifices himself for an abstract principle, the freedom of expression. The work itself was commissioned by advocates of a free economic market in France and for greater public discussion than that permitted under the Ancien regime of the French monarchy. By contrasting the movements of the energetic but controlled Socrates with his grief-stricken friends and followers in various states of collapse and despair, David's painting can be viewed as a call for nobility and self-control even in the face of death. Death is not to be feared but welcomed. We see Socrates continuing to speak even when he is reaching for the cup. We see him demonstrating his indifference to death and his unyielding commitment to his ideals, whilst those around him betray the weakness of the emotions. In an echo of Raphael's classic painting, The School of Athens, which has Socrates pointing to the heavens and Aristotle pointing to the earth, Socrates is pointing to the heavens, the place of the immortal soul, the place of the immutable reality of the forms. Away from, so just in the this left-hand corner here, away from, through the arch, we can see his wife and possibly one of his children waving him farewell as they leave the prison. Plato at the foot of the bed and Crito, hand on Socrates' leg, seem a little more in control, although Plato seems rather detached and lost in his own thoughts. So for David's contemporaries, the painting would have had echoes of recent political events and perhaps a sense of what was to come in the turbulent times of pre- and revolutionary France. And with the French Revolution just 2 years away, the painting can be viewed as a rebuke to those who might lack the courage to resist unjust authority. Okay, so if I'm just going to skip a few lines. If we just turn over, I'm just jumping ahead, just to the end of the first paragraph of the next page. And just to point out this intensity of the physical expressiveness that is sort of present in the weeping, grieving, despairing figures that surround Socrates. You know, they're wreathed and contorted and twisted. Socrates is upright, he's got a really sort of solid core. It's well supported, and he's looking beyond, he's looking, not even looking at the cup, sort of rational, clear-headed, even at the moment of death. And it's as if we are attending a performance in which the courage of self-sacrifice is contrasted with weakness, is framed by it. And I think it's very easy to be seduced by this picture of philosophical heroism. There's something very attractive about it. And we think it important to have the courage of our convictions and to be willing to risk ostracization, to risk being cast out. And I want to support this picture with a quote from a man called Atif Rafi. And it's taken from a recent book published called Philosophy Imprisoned, The Love of Wisdom in the Age of Mass Incarceration. And the book itself is a collection of essays, it's an American publication, on the subject of philosophy and prisons in America. And with a number of contributors in the book, prisoners on death row. And he is one of them. And he writes, "It is vital to remember that free thinking was punished with death, that philosophy was from its inception anathema to the world, and that Socrates was imprisoned and judicially murdered for crimes against the people. But most important, that philosophy aspires to the condition of such crime, defining itself in deliberate opposition to orthodoxy, meaningful to the extent that it stands against what prevails, profound to the degree that it stands apart, riven by the obvious tension between these criteria. Philosophy coheres nonetheless because its unconcerned, skeptical curiosity possesses an integrity that it outrages conventional pieties more than any alternative faith can." Now it is perhaps a somewhat exaggerated, perhaps a grandiose representation of philosophical thought, but it's this idea of standing apart, of challenging norms, of being unconventional. And Rafi, his paper is actually a paper on Nietzsche and the idea of a free spirit. And he supports this with a reference to Nietzsche's comment that philosophers somehow cut themselves off from the community, willingly cut themselves off from the community when they address themselves to the individual and disregard the morality of what passes for custom. And this image of philosophy as fearlessly taking us outside convention, as occupying a critical, reflective space that is set apart, is very much present in our perhaps more cooler ideas of detachment and critical distance. And as such, it represents an ambition of philosophical thought, even where it's not so melodramatically a matter of life and death. Now I want to contrast that with the sense of the philosopher as perhaps not an outsider, and philosophical thought not being placed on the outside, but as part of something. Socrates dies among friends, but he does so by choice. He could have fled Athens, saved by the very friends who now grieve for him, and it was what they wanted, but it was not what he wanted. And in the dialogue Crito, which precedes Phaedo, which is the dialogue in which the death of Socrates is described, he describes why. The dialogue begins with Crito coming to visit Plato in his cell. He brings news that the boat which has set sail to Delos on its annual mission to celebrate the victory of Theseus over the Minotaur had been spotted. It had left on the day before Socrates' trial, and no execution could take place until the day after its return. Crito puts forward several arguments for why Socrates should escape. First, he argues that Socrates is endangering the reputation of his friends. Secondly, he tells Socrates that he should not worry about any dangers his friends might face as a result of helping him to escape, and nor should he, worry about the cost. Crito then suggests that there are plenty of places where Socrates could live an enjoyable life. And he then tells Socrates he's acting unjustly in joining with his enemies against himself. He's acting unjustly by not fulfilling his obligations to his children. And finally, it's an act of cowardice that will reflect badly on his friends as well as himself. And Socrates then responds to Crito and puts forward various arguments about why Crito is wrong. And if we just move about 6 or 7 lines down in this paragraph at the bottom of the page, I want to just jump ahead. And to answer these things, this question of why Socrates' own action in fleeing the state would be an unjust and harmful action towards the state, he introduces the voice of the laws of Athens. And this voice is like a parental voice, reasoning with its child, Socrates. And the laws begin by arguing that despite bringing Socrates into the world, rearing him and educating him, giving him a share in all the good things at their disposal, he was always free to leave and go wherever he chose with whatever he wanted to take with him, be it to go to a colony or indeed another state. Instead, he chose to stay and thereby committed himself to either obeying the laws or persuading them to change their decision if they are wrong. And by choosing to flee, Socrates is doing neither. And their point, given the life that Socrates has lived, is that perhaps he, more than any other, has made that commitment. And the quote is as follows: "Compared with all other Athenians, you would not have been so exceptionally in residence if it had not been so exceptionally pleasing to you. You have never left the city to attend a festival except once to the Isthmus, nor for any other purpose except on some military expedition. You have never travelled abroad as other people do, and you have never felt the impulse to acquaint yourself with another country or other laws. You have been content with us and with our city. So deliberately have you chosen us and undertaken to observe us in all your activities as a citizen, that you have actually fathered children in it because the city suits you." And having said he prefers death to banishment, a form of punishment he could have suggested, how can he now choose to flee? And the laws conclude by asking Socrates to imagine what kind of life in exile awaits him, treated with suspicion wherever he goes, something of a laughingstock, justifying all the actions that were made against him by his behaviour. And this, I want to suggest, is more a picture of the philosopher as the insider. It's a portrayal of someone who's very much part of a community, and the reasons why he wishes to stay, why he is obedient to the laws of the state, doing its will as part of its life, is because of the place that he has had in its life and it has had in his life. And it's perhaps an extreme picture, but it's not a picture of the philosopher as a sort of extreme outsider. Now, before continuing, I want to say something about the concept of banishment. I think it's of being forced to leave a city. I mean, the point I'm going to make is that to be forced to leave a city, to leave the place where you live. And I think that the point that I want to make is that it's a concept, the idea of banishment is perhaps a concept that is no longer part of our understanding of what it means to be a citizen in the modern world. It contains within it a very strong embodied idea of inclusion and exclusion. But it's an idea from a world of city walls and city gates, the city state rather than the nation state. And it's the idea of a person belonging to a very specific kind of jurisdiction. Now, we no longer remove unwanted people in this way by physically banishing them, placing them outside the city, outside the walls. And I just wanted to, as an example of just what that means, I think it's a nice sort of little scene from Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, when Romeo is banished by the Prince of Verona for his involvement in the death of Tybalt, Juliet's kinsman. And for Romeo, it is a devastating event. And the Friar Lawrence, gives Romeo the news that he is to be banished. But that is rather than him being executed. And Romeo says, "Ha, banishment, be merciful, say death. For exile hath more terror in his look, much more than death. Do not say banishment." And he continues, "There is no world without Verona walls, but purgatory, torture, hell itself. Hence banished is banished from the world, and world's exile is death. Then banished is death mistermed. Calling death banishment, thou cutt'st my head off with a golden axe, and smilest upon the stroke that murders me." So for Romeo, to be banished is something sort of worse than death. And so it is with Socrates as well. And this notion, I mean, just as a brief aside, this notion of inside and outside, of belonging and not belonging, of home and homelessness, is present in quite a few of Shakespeare's plays. For example, he uses the device of the shipwreck in The Tempest, in Twelfth Night, to give us characters who find themselves in strange places, who find themselves homeless. And King Lear, for example, presents us with an acute sense of homelessness. Lear loses his home. Lear is sort of abandoned on the heath. And even in a play like Hamlet, for example, there is the main character's estrangement from and entrapment in his home, that sense that his home is no longer the place for him, no longer the place he wants to be, but he's trapped there. Okay, so I now want to move on to section 3, which is a kind of attempt to sort of try and bring these two ideas together. And I'm looking at the philosopher, the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler. And Stiegler, I think about 12, 13 years ago now in French, but I think this was translated into English 2009, describes how he became a philosopher. I must confess, I've had real problems with this section. I thought I'd understood Stiegler until last night. And now I'm not so sure. Now suddenly there's so much more. So I will do my best to try and convey my understanding of Stiegler, not confuse you, not lose you. Certainly I think in comparison with the Arendt that we've just been reading, I think there's something quite, if you like, featureless or faceless about this, whereas the Arendt sort of seems much more human, but we'll see how we go. And both pictures seem to be, the inside and the outside, both seem to be recognizable pictures of the Socrates and the sort of the sort of Socratic philosophy that Plato represents. Socrates was clearly a very singular person, and it is this individuality that is the accusation made against him before the trial and the death sentence is pronounced. And yet, despite this sort of act of exclusion, imprisonment, and execution, I think it's important that for Socrates that his death falls within the laws of Athens. And I wanted to try and work out why. Just what is it that's so important? Perhaps beyond just ideas of acting justly, beyond the ideas put forward in the Phaedo of philosophy as a preparation for death. Important as those thoughts might be, that perhaps there are other aspects to this as well. And in part, I want to suggest it's a question of language. And I do not mean that in fleeing, Socrates will no longer use his mother tongue, but that something important about his relationship to his words would have been lost. The idea not only of being held to account for what one says, but that it matters one stands behind one's words, one takes responsibility, and that one is not speaking emptily or in cliches. However, that this will depend on his existing in a certain kind of milieu, a certain kind of place. What interested me about Stiegler as a philosopher was that Stiegler's life was transformed while he was in prison. However, Stiegler's story is not the story of the philosopher imprisoned as a result of their philosophical thought. Stiegler came to philosophy while serving a 5-year prison sentence for armed robbery. So he was a criminal before he was a philosopher. And Stiegler traces the origins of this in the essay How I Became a Philosopher. And what's interesting, and the connection that I was trying to make, is that he discusses the interconnectedness between Socrates, the individual who was a philosopher, and the city of Athens and its laws. So he tries to bring these two ideas together, that the philosopher is something apart, but the philosopher is also something connected. And Stiegler begins by asking whether becoming a philosopher is something you experience as a vocation. And the idea of a vocation was in the past most commonly thought of in religious terms. For example, a calling to be a priest or a nun. And it still retains that sense, but nowadays is used more generally. So, for example, someone might feel that they have a vocation for teaching or for medicine. And it captures something more than just a career. And it's experienced as a calling, as something that is personal and is addressed to the individual, that sets you apart, marks you out in some way. And something that Stiegler will describe as a moment in a process of individuation, of becoming individual. Against that, he wonders, is that kind of becoming a philosopher something more like the way in which an artist or a musician or a writer experiences their calling in dedicating their life to the special gift or talent that they possess, something rare, something uncommon. And for Stiegler wants to suggest that it's something of both. That it can be thought of as a kind of gift, but that the philosopher emerges from amongst us, that the philosopher is part of their community. It's not that they already have a special gift that marks them out, but that somehow it's an act of separation which comes from within the group. And if there is such a thing as a philosophical calling, then it does not carry with it the sense of a dedication and devotion to a special talent. All of us could be devoted to philosophy. And this would immediately constitute a gift that is common to us all. And so for Stiegler, there appears to be something quite distinct about becoming a philosopher. It's not exactly a religious calling, it's not exactly something artistic, nor even something scientific. It kind of shares in these things, but it's both very singular, very individual, very personal, but equally something that at least potentially we all share, and part of what is common to us. And therefore it's in this sense that Stiegler thinks there's something odd about saying someone has a gift for philosophy. And yet such a sentiment does not seem completely out of place. So it's something both intimate and something very personal, and yet also something that is common. And it is to Socrates that Stiegler turns in order to discuss this. And he describes Socrates, I think, perhaps in the Western sense, as the proto-philosopher, the sort of model, the inauguration of the idea of the philosopher. And Socrates' life, and in particular his death, do possess a sacrificial dimension. It is the singularity of his life and his dedication to thought that marks him out. However, the paradox of the life of Socrates is that his singularity, that which makes him separate and individual, is tied to the idea of the city, the polis, to that which he belongs. And thus Stiegler thinks that thinking of Socrates in this way makes sense only insofar as it is tied to the destiny of this other individuality that constitutes the city. And that it's this that Socrates testifies to and in a way institutes in the course of his trial. And for Stiegler, what is vital and relevant in philosophy is the interconnectedness of what he calls the I and the we in the process of this idea of individuation. Drawing on Aristotle's understanding of man as a political animal, he argues that we are not human except insofar as we belong to a social group. And this sociality is always in a state of becoming. The group and the individual in that group never cease to seek out their path. So both are evolving, both are becoming, both the individual and the group to which the individual belongs, in a sense that they're always in some way a work in progress. And Stiegler writes that it's within the framework of such a process that in all his activities, Socrates participates in the individuation of the city, and right up until the end, and therefore to the extreme, he links his individual destiny to collective destiny. And that Socrates, by tying his death to the city in a certain manner, inaugurates the philosophical attitude that founds all philosophy as an exemplary relation of the I and the we. So for Stiegler, that the philosopher is not the paradigmatic outsider. There is something about the philosopher that is very much part of the world in which he or she exists. But at the same time, they are still separate from that in their own individuality. And for Stiegler, coming to be a philosopher is accidental, but he comes to see it as a necessity. And Stiegler uses the image, this is where it gets very complicated in terms of how Stiegler understands his time in prison. And prison becomes both a place that is part of his world, but it's also a world that he sort of imagines he's leaving behind. As he philosophizes, he sort of leaves that world behind, and he creates this world in which he exists. It's tied to ideas of reminiscence, of recreating the world through his writings and through his access to books and to philosophy, and that this is where it gets quite complicated. But he sees himself as like a flying fish over the water. So he's not a sort of fish within the water. His philosophizing takes him outside his environment, but only temporarily. It's that moment of suspension and then back in. So philosophizing for him are these moments of separation, of being outside, that sort of clarity of thinking that takes him beyond the milieu of the prison and into a different kind of realm. And for Stiegler, it's very much this idea of the philosopher as sort of coming into contact with the divine in some way. However, and Stiegler sees this whole period of his life as a preparation, as a period of change and a preparation to prepare himself for a return to the outside world. And for him, that is the virtue of prison, that it enables him to go back into the world. However, one problem that can be seen to arise in this ongoing process of individuation is that the individual may no longer feel themselves to be part of their wider community, that the changes in one or the other, or both, are such as to cause them to no longer possess that kind of mutuality, that world to which they feel they can contribute is no longer there for them in the way that they want. And Stiegler writes of this, that the more time passed, the more I feared falling back into that world, the more I sensed that the world refound would not be immediately welcoming. So in a sense, he has sort of created this sort of nostalgia for the world as it was before he went into prison. He's lived with this philosophizing, this reminiscing about that world. But now, as he finds himself facing going back into the world, he's worried that it will no longer be the world as he thinks it to be. And this prompts him to reflect 25 years on, so now 2008, both on the nature of change in his own life and in the world he subsequently rejoined. And for him, he says that this world has in effect revealed itself to be appallingly inhospitable. And he describes a world full of people who are alarmed and overwhelmed by life, stupefied by marketing and the media, a world of estrangement. I've nearly finished. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. I'll just do a little bit more, just a little summary. Yeah? Okay. Now, my conclusion, when I first was thinking of this, I thought I had a really neat, clear conclusion. I now feel I don't quite have that clarity in what I wanted to say. And what I tried to do in drawing on Stiegler was to think how notions of separation and connectedness, inclusion and exclusion are all present in philosophizing. And I had hoped that Stiegler would provide me with some kind of neat way of making sense of how to understand this idea of the inside and the outside of philosophy. And I think that Stiegler's account does allow us to understand how the relationship of the individual to the social group is mutually interdependent at both the personal, dialogical level and in the wider sense of how the individual contributes to the particular identity of the group, of the ongoing creation of the identity of the group. And that the way in which we become individual should be understood in this way. And yet I felt more as I read Stiegler that there was still this element of the heroic going on. I still felt that in Stiegler there is this idea of the philosopher as being willing to die for his or her beliefs. And so this picture sort of came back into my thinking, that I thought that I had a way of sort of understanding the mutual dependency, but something else about Stiegler's understanding of vocation and calling brought me back to this at the end. So I'm kind of left in this slightly uncertain position. And that's it. Thank you.
About 10 minutes discussion time, but to help the audience to follow the line of your thinking, can I ask you very quick two questions for clarification?
Okay.
On page...
Sorry, I should have numbered them, yes.
Section, so 1 to page 3, the second paragraph, which begins with, it's very easy to be seduced by the heroism.
Yeah.
And on the third line, you say something like, to be willing to risk ostracization and being cast out. And you say, I want to support this picture with a quote from blah, blah. I'm not sure whether you endorse this position or not, but the first question, or point of clarification, is that this idea of ostracization, especially willing to risk oneself toward ostracization, sounds decidedly different from the one who is with beyond one's control being exiled. This is kind of willingness.
Yes.
To
You think Are you thinking in relation to for someone like Arendt, for example, who has to go into exile?
Yeah, so I just
Yeah.
wanted to ask you to clarify the point of this whole argument is to support this kind of position of risk oneself to get ostracized, or is it not your point?
Yes, that was the point that I was trying to suggest in this picture
So if
of
that's the case,
philosophy.
I think there is a sort of slight difference from what is the name of Kassan? Because she's talking about the position one who is being fated to be exiled in a passive form, whereas what you're talking about here is more sort of active will of risking oneself to be ostracized.
Yes.
That's one point.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah.
I don't know. It's 1, 2, 3, the third page from the end.
Yeah.
But on the first paragraph, which begins with imprisonment, and you say that in part, I won't suggest in the question of language, which you speak, but you say that in Socrates' case, it has to do with one's relation to language, and then you say, but that it matters one stands behind one's language, that one is not speaking emptily or in a cliche. We talked about cliche. So could you clarify a bit about the whole point which you try to make and our connection with the question of language?
Yes, I was thinking that there's that sense that Socrates, as Plato sort of captures it in what is said, that Socrates' ability to be taken seriously in what he says is dependent on his sort of life having a certain kind of integrity. And that it would lose that integrity. And there'd be a sense in which his words would seem to be empty if he is to flee, to leave, to go, to remove himself from Athens and from that world in which he has come to, his language has come to sort of be taken, has that seriousness about it. And that's not so much a question of losing his mother tongue, but losing that ability to have his words taken seriously, of being responded to as serious, that what he says is worth attending to.
Yeah, but in the end of your talk, you say that the process of individuation doesn't have meaning unless you have a connection with the we. The we,
Yeah.
language community of the
Yes,
So-
and that is, and that we is this sort of the sort of the dialogical, the nature of the dialogical relationship that Socrates has with his community, with those he speaks to, and how that has come to be understood within Athens. That's so there's that dialogical sense that it's that he brings to the polis, to Athens.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So,
Thank you, Adrian. That was really thought-provoking. I think just following on from Marco's line of questioning there, and I don't know whether this is sort of trying to read too much into it, but could we? I'm quite intrigued by this image of the flying fish, and I can see Stiegler in prison in the water, sort of leaping into philosophy, into the air, into a different rarefied place, but gravity being what it is, falling back into the water. And I don't know whether, once again, whether this is reading too much into it, but could we view Socrates and his philosophy as a flying fish as well, with the water being the polis and the language, and that his philosophy enables him to transgress the polis by leaping beyond its usual domain. His followers who urge him to flee are effectively urging him to fly, but he realizes this is impossible. He knows that the gravity will draw him down. He will disappoint his followers, and as you say, his integrity will be breached. So he takes the poison, knowing that he will fall down into the water anyway. So he submits to the laws of the polis. Is that taking it too far?
I don't think so. There is that sense of in the Stiegler of these moments in which he's sort of outside his world.
So Crito is effectively saying, "Be purely I," but Socrates insists, "No, I must be we."
Yeah.
So the language and that which has allowed him to fly out of the waters
and that,
inescapable.
If we're looking at how Stiegler understands this has any kind of resonance, that Socrates can only be an I within that context. So it's the picture of the flying fish and what the flying fish is above. It's the two together.
He's a fish, not a bird.
Well, the bird could stay there. I think
Yes, that's right.
that sense, whereas he can't. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's a really good talk. I was intrigued also about the flying fish, because you said about death. And a fish, if the fish leaves the lake where it lives to the air, it can die. So this freedom that you were talking about, that he had, like a flying fish, to be an outsider for a while, could take him to death. So yeah.
I think this is it. He's trying to. There's a section which is very much based on Aristotle and the idea that the thing that the fish is not aware of is its water. That's just its place, and he is trying to capture something of being both a fish out of water, someone for whom philosophy, doing philosophy and becoming a philosopher and philosophizing sort of takes him beyond or comes into tension with the prison cell where he is. He doesn't want to see himself just as a fish out of water. That's not how he imagines the philosophy. But nor is he a fish in water, i.e. unaware of his world. He is somewhere in between, and he moves between these two worlds of being part of that world, that philosophy can't free him completely from the prison. But there's a sense in which through philosophy there are these moments when he is somehow beyond, transcends, is no longer within that place which is the prison, but somewhere else before coming back in. And it's that sort of in and out.
Able to see the water as water.
Yes.
Rather than just what's around you.
Yes, and that's that sense of the philosopher as sort of separate, able to see the water, that sort of distance. That's the idea. I think that's what he's trying to capture here.
I want to ask you about the flying fish. The image of flying is also. Sorry.
No,
again.
it's interesting. That's what's...
In your in your explanation, the flying fish is flying fish go beyond the community.
Yeah.
And out in the air. But I want to ask you, what is it like to be in a state of to be in the air? I think in Kassen's case, she is in Arendt's case, she is go outside the German, and go into the America, and he belonged to America. But in flying fish's case, there is no community outside the water. And I want to ask you the state of air.
I think Arendt, I think you're right. I mean, and I think I felt this as I was working on the paper, that the Cassin and her discussion of Arendt sort of takes us. There are connections. I'm starting to hear the connections between the Stiegler and the Cassin. But the Arendt, the Cassin is, it's a different place. I think that this idea, perhaps this is what Nauka was asking earlier. The Arendt, the exile is. It's almost like, I think I'm almost alongside the way in which I've tried to describe the Stiegler, but it's not the same. It's something different, and I think that's something that that could be sort of explored further, especially the discussion that we were looking at the airborne routes. I think that's something that could be taken further. So I think I'm thinking of these things as sort of perhaps adjacent to each other, but not sort of. It's different in some way.
No, my question kind of follows on from what Kensuke was saying. I find it difficult to imagine what it's like to be a suspended fish out of water for a variety of reasons. But if you think about the self as something that's dialogical, that's always in dialogue with other people or with experiences, and never quite separate from those, then it's difficult for me to conceive of something as suspended from that context. I think even if we are imprisoned or separate, we still have, and Charles Taylor talks about this quite a lot, and he gives the example of a hermit, so somebody who lives outside of society willingly, but even in that case, the hermit is having some kind of a conversation with God or with his past, perhaps. He's never fully suspended. So, I mean, I don't know if that's just my kind of idea of I can't really imagine.
I think so. I think Stiegler is trying to capture something of the individual on their own, in their own thought, in their silence, in their cell. He talks about in their intimacy, those very sort of internal kind of experience. But it is also one which he the important thing for Stiegler, and which links him to the connection that he makes between Socrates and the laws of Athens and himself and the laws of France, is that the laws of France have provided the prison with a library. And that is his salvation, if you like. It's books. And so alongside this idea perhaps of the flying fish, perhaps of a certain kind of individual experience, is how it is his relationships to the texts that he reads, to Saussure, Wittgenstein, Derrida, Kant, and so on. So there is that dialogical element there, but not with others.
Yeah.
Well, no, because he corresponded with a French philosopher outside called Grenelle. So he had an ongoing dialogue with someone beyond the prison walls.
What I mean is more so that the I and the we can never be separated. They exist together. It's constant. So it's not just. So it's kind of how Hegel talks about the I and the we. It's a knot. It's a thing that exists together. It can never be separated. So the fish is never out of the water. Really, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. No. I think perhaps rather than seeing these things completely in conflict, that these are sort of perhaps two kinds of understandings that Stiegler is trying to work with. So he would agree with, I think that's one of the key points, is that the I and the we can never be completely separated, and that is an ongoing thing. And he wants to suggest even in Death, Socrates, that the we becomes the the philosophy that follows. In some sense, even in death, Socrates is part of the we. We're talking about him now. Yeah.
So